Welcome, everyone. This is Dr. Mercola helping you take control of your health, and we continue to provide you up-to-date information in this COVID-19 pandemic which we're experiencing in the United States. So we're recording this on April 6th, and there are well over 100,000, actually 300,000 confirmed cases, 325,000 in the United States. Which is far exceeds any other country in the world. China reporting 82,000 for the last 3 weeks. Can we believe those statistics? No, I don't think so. I mean, that doesn't make any sense at all that they just somehow dramatically stopped having any spread of this infection. So, but be it as it may, we have over 10,000 reported deaths, supposedly COVID-19. The vast majority, not the majority, but most of them, I guess over 1/3 of them are in the New York City area, which is interesting. So it's continued to increase, and we're meeting today with Dr. Shiva, who is has a degree from MIT, his PhD from MIT. It's one of my favorite schools. I think it's one of the most prestigious academic institutions in the world. And I believe his degree is in systems biology. So maybe we can start there and we can talk about this, because you have a framework, a perspective that allows you to think differently than the conventional medical position paradigm on this, and that it tends to really focus more on the foundational causes of disease rather than the pharmaceutical paradigm, essentially. So welcome, thank you for joining us, and maybe you can elaborate on your background and your training and your systems biology approach.
Sure, Joe. The MIT Department of Biological Engineering was actually a new department, relatively new, that was created in 2003. And the notion was, as you had chemical engineering, which was really applying engineering principles to chemistry, the notion was that you needed an engineering approach to biology as new advances or new, discoveries were coming out in biology. So that created the Department of Biological Engineering. Interestingly enough, that department, every department of MIT is numbered, course numbers. That was called Course 20. It was formerly the Department of Food and Nutrition Science in the 70s. But one of the big things that took place in 2003 that really led to the formation of that department was, in an ironic way, what occurred with the Human Genome Project starting in 1993, where we went into the Genome Project with a reductionist view of biology. And what do I mean by that? I mean that biologists essentially thought that the number of parts meant complexity. So we knew in 1993, a worm had around 20,000 genes. So we said, okay, we're going to start mapping out the human genome. So we said, well, we're at least 25 times more complex. So the notion was we had about 500,000 genes. And then as you see the numbers, as they're searching for all these genes, by 2003, they only find 20,000 protein coding genes. So that flipped biology on its head, because it said, wait a minute, if we have the same number of parts, which they thought genes were really the reflection of complexity, then what's going on? So that led to systems biology starting around 2003, which said, look, genes create proteins and these proteins interact. So it's all these interactions we really need to start understanding, all the way from the molecular level at the cellular level, going to tissues to organs, to build a whole framework for understanding the whole physiome. So that was really the birth of systems biology, but ironically came out of a reductionist viewpoint that genes, we're only our genes. And that today has led to this field called epigenetics, which we know that the external environment, what we interact with, can actually turn on and turn off genes. So I came back to MIT in 2003. My background, as you mentioned, is in engineering. I did 4 degrees at MIT in electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, my master's in design, but I've always was fascinated with medicine. And in fact, I was always would apply for medical school and always had this sort of one step in and one step out, because there's some aspect of medicine, the reductionist approach of seeing the body as parts, that never made sense. The good news was in 2003, when I came back, the project that I took on for my PhD came out of a grand challenge that the National Science Foundation put out, which was, could you mathematically model the whole human cell? It's quite an intractable problem. And so that's what I took on, and that resulted in a creation of a platform that we call CytoSolve, CYTO for cell and solve. And it was essentially saying, Joe took a very different approach than a biology approach or a computer science approach or a chemistry approach. It said, look, biologists are essentially distributed knowledge engineers. And the thing they're trying to understand is this thing called the body, no different than aeronautical engineers trying to build the airplane. the difference is when we build an airplane, we actually know what we want to build and we know the parts. In biology, we're finding the parts, and the biologists, that's what they're doing. Some, biologists can win a Nobel Prize just for looking at how two proteins interact. So they're very focused on understanding these parts. So imagine if we could create a technology where we could take those parts, integrate them, and then essentially let them be sort of focused in their silos, but there would be this framework that you could integrate these molecular pathways. And that really created Cytosolve. And to me, it was a big circling back, because as you know, I've spoken to you before, I grew up in India in a very different world as a kid, where my grandmother practiced traditional systems of medicine. And in that system of medicine, they had diagnosis methods. They looked at you, they figured out your body type, and they would figure out the right types of foods and medicines, herbs, or even body work to figure how to get you back into balance. And that was always seen as a quote unquote a black art from Western medicine. And here, this approach lets us actually decipher what they were doing and actually understand these synergies. So that's what systems biology is about. It's taking an engineering systems approach to the body, which unfortunately the medical doctor who graduates from medical school, they're essentially very siloed. They don't sort of learn an integrative approach. An engineering systems approach.
Yeah, and it's even worse than that. And it's engineered that way because more than a century ago, they had the Carnegie Foundation, which intervened, and I forget, the Flexner Report was created, which essentially integrated the Rockefeller Foundation and the oil interest, which were, for the most part, heavily connected to the pharmaceutical industry because they provided the raw material to make most of the drugs, and they shifted things away from homeopathy and natural healing therapies, and really wasn't taught. I went to medical school, and those topics are not part of the discussion. It's pretty much a drug-based model on how to solve the human dilemma. And in your clinical training, it's literally understand how to diagnose and assess and identify what the problem is, and then how to administer a prescription within a few minutes. That's pretty much the summary of the training.
Yeah. The model is in many ways a if-then-else model, right?
Right.
In the 80s at MIT, there was a lot of people trying to build this guy, Joseph Weissman, where you had a computer where you could talk to it and it would ask you certain questions and it would go if, then, else, and would go into essentially the PDR and figure out what was right for you. But essentially, it's a quote unquote an AI type model. You could argue that MDs are already AI. It's just they're in a carbon-based being. But like you say, the medical education is essentially big pharma-based medical education. It's not intended to enable the physician to really see the body as an interconnected system of parts, the ankle bone's connected to the foot bone. And I think that reductionism is what we have today. And going back, I think when you look at the history of medicine, it's always also try to reduce everything by and large, whenever even a non-infectious disease was there, to always try to reduce it to an infectious disease, correlate this microbe or this particular virus with this particular disease. And that has really not changed that much, because it essentially is a way of reducing medicine to if this, this is a particular microbe or solution. And you can look at that whole history from scurvy to pellagra to Burberry, every major disease, it's almost everything is a nail and you only have one solution, which is a hammer.
Yeah, the hammer, typically the pharmaceutical surgical paradigm. But
yeah,
with that perspective, I'd like to jump into the COVID-19 pandemic that we're all going through now. It really has captured everyone's attention, and rightfully so, because the vast majority of the people watching this are probably sheltered in their home and really admonished that to not go outside their home, and really challenged with that. They're not working, which is going to lead to essentially an economic catastrophe. We are absolutely on course to break all the unemployment records that were created during the Great Depression of the 1920s, 30s. So we're on course to break that. And the economic catastrophe that results from that will, in my view, invariably, unquestionably result in at least an order of magnitude more deaths than we have now from this infection. So why don't you give us your take on this as we look at it on April 6th?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. We're looking at, what's fascinating is you're looking at immune health and economic health. So we're seeing the integration of medical policy and economic policy. Interesting enough, I had a very interesting discussion with a very leading economist, and he had a serious concern about the fact that economists are being forced to backfill in a misguided health policy, which is occurring, and we can talk about that, with economic policy. And what he meant by that is just basically use quantitative easing, which is basically print money. And that will solve the problem. Now, that entire process, like you just referred to, does two things. First of all, we have, I think, 10 million people did unemployment claims just in March alone. So you have unemployment. In addition to that, you have the fact that we're going to print money, which will, and most of that, if you look since 2008-9, when quantitative easing took place, starting, what that's actually done is it essentially moved, it's been the biggest transfer of wealth to the 0.001% again. And it is essentially weakened, essentially earning power and the meaning of the dollar. So that's what's occurred. So now we have this COVID-19, and we see this overreaction, in my opinion, economically, from the fear mongering. And it's, in many ways, it reflects, if we study the immune system, that if you actually analyze it, that the immune system fundamentally wants to operate well for you in homeostasis. And it's the overreaction of a weakened and dysfunctional immune system, which actually causes harm. And then similarly, when you look at it from the economic standpoint, we have this unbridled overreaction, in my view, to not looking at even what modern medicine is saying, that we should take a personalized medicine approach, right? One size doesn't fit all. This is basically flatten the curve, right? Essentially kick the can down the street, and we're just going to wait until when? Until a vaccine is produced or until a drug comes out. And the idea is the assumption that the immune system of all of us is equally weak, right? That's what this is based on. The assumption is that all of us are going to get it and all of us will suffer from it. So it's a very interesting model. So when you look at someone like, the person leading this health policy, a guy like Fauci, if I can speak to that, his background is from the pharmaceutical world. He's been there for around 40 years, from the time of Reagan to he's been there across multiple presidents over 4 decades. And as a part of that, when you look at the NIH and when you look at the CDC and the WHO, these organizations are heavily influenced by pharmaceutical companies. If you look at the CDC, it's literally a rotating door between pharma and CDC, pharma and CDC. So in that environment, the model has always been never to discuss immune health, what we can do to support the immune system. It's always under the assumption that there's this big boogeyman, and that the virus harms your body. It is a thing. Most medical doctors, again, they're victims of this education. Many of them, if you ask, they're taught almost that the virus literally comes and attacks your body, and a vaccine or a pharmaceutical intervention blocks it. It's not taught broadly to people that it's the dysfunctional, weakened immune system where it's not running on all cylinders. One part of it can overreact, and that overreaction is what goes and attacks your own tissues. So the issue is we're not having a discussion at all in any of the broad media about how do you modulate that overreaction and support people's immune health. So it's a very fascinating thing. We're seeing the lack of discussion of this overreaction of a weakened immune system. And over here, we have an overreaction on the economic side.
Two responses to that, and we'll discuss what the strategies you can implement to improve your immune system, because there was a lot of controversy in the media that some big media outlets were saying, no, it's impossible to improve your immune system. You just can't. That just is a bunch of fabrication. But I would have a slight disagreement with the fact that this economic collapse is a result of the fear. It's not a result of the fear. It's a result of precisely engineered governmental policies that are seeking to address this. Now, superficially, it may appear, or ostensibly may appear to be in the public's best interest. But I think and I'd like you to respond to this, that they know at a deep foundational level that this is not this is not a pandemic. The WHO declared it, I mean, they can call it, technically it is because it's a worldwide infection, but it doesn't compare to the previous epidemics. We have the Spanish flu in 1918, 40, 50 million people. You have the bubonic plague, 1300s, that literally wiped out 60% of Europe, 60% of the population. We are looking at an incredibly tiny fraction of our population being decimated, far less than 0.1%. That it's going to be impaired. Now, tragically, it's sad that people are dying, but there are simple strategies that don't require to collapse the entire economy and put people in isolation and cause this massive unemployment that you referenced. So,
yeah, I wrote a letter to the president, and I said, look, one of the things that came out in 2003, when you go back to systems biology, was a notion of one size does not fit all. Okay, this was a fundamental thesis. Even Francis Collins at the NIH, at least purportedly, supported it, which is we need to move to the right medicine for the right person at the right time. So let's look at public health. I mean, this is just a thing that's in the last 17 years, everyone claims they want to support this, at least in Western medicine. So if you look at the public health issue right here, you basically said, we're not going to apply that. Everyone is going to be treated the same way. So when I meant the fear mongering, I did a tweet that said, the fear mongering that is taking place is being used to suppress dissent, to crash the economy, and also to issue medical mandates. It has sort of a three-pronged effect. Now, I think we probably will agree. I think that fear mongering was engineered because you have a broad base of the American public, which has basically been made to think that, as you just said, that other alternate solutions, vitamins or these kinds of things, these are seen as on the fringe, and that everything always must have come from pharma or medical intervention. So that fear mongering is really the weaponry that was used to crash the economy, to suppress dissent and impose what I think is going to be long-term mandates. But if you look, just in the last 6 months, Hong Kong, people were protesting out there, massive protests. In Wuhan itself, which very few people know, the New York Times carried one article 6 months ago. There were massive anti-pollution protests by the citizens of Wuhan because China wants to build all these incinerator plants. It's not like the Chinese people also want to breathe dirty air. You had massive protests in France. You had massive protests in Venezuela. If you just look broadly, there were massive uprisings, anti-establishment uprisings. Well, they're all gone now. Overnight, 2 weeks, we don't even hear anything about them, right? But I think the fear mongering, what it is going to establish, and you layer on the economic pieces, that in 6 months, 7 months from now, let's say when the next quote unquote epidemic comes, I think it's going to be used as a way for people to essentially accept what the state wants or what a few set of people deem that is good for everyone. And that's, I think, the milieu that's being set up, that's being teed up. Oh my God. By the way, H1N1, right? Even the last flu season, 60 million people. We don't even have to go to the bubonic plague, right? Or just in the last year, 60,000 people died out of 60 million people. 17% of the US population was actually infected with the flu, and 6%, about 60,000 people died. That isn't even being taken into account. So this entire decision that this is a pandemic, this is such an important event that we have to shut down the economy. When things don't make sense, one of my mentors taught me, Joe, is there's another agenda. Yeah. And that's what I see, because it doesn't make any rational sense. And I think that's why a number of the videos, the tweets I've been doing just have been going viral, because to everyday working people, it doesn't make sense. They're trying to sort this out.
Yeah. And I think I've seen your other videos address the fact that there are true, maybe not pandemics, but epidemics for certain, of death and disease that are completely reversible and if they received enough attention and focus, we could have a significant improvement in true improvement in public health. These would be heart disease. These would be deaths from accidental prescription. You have a whole litany of them that you wanted. So maybe you can address those, because those are the true epidemics. And just one other comment that I want you to integrate in that is that the access to information has been cleverly engineered to be selectively removed, because in June, literally 9-10 months ago, Google, which 92% of the world's population uses as a search engine to find information on the internet, because if it's on the internet, it's almost irrelevant. You have to identify and find it. They removed hundreds and hundreds of natural health sites that we don't exist anymore. I'm one of them. And so when people seek to identify natural strategies and they go online to find it, they're not going to find it. They essentially removed it. You would have had to been in the know before the epidemic to identify these sites, because you're not going to find it otherwise.
Well, it's interesting you say that, Joe. I was just kicked off Twitter just moments before this interview, which is one of my
welcome to the club.
Yeah, and it's because I put out a tweet. This was almost 2 weeks ago. It said, "It is beyond criminal for the medical establishment is not," and I put quote unquote mandating vitamin D. It was a joke, not a joke, but I was being.
No, that's clever. That's clever, funny, and that there's to use it as basis for banning you is reprehensible.
And I said a proven solution because there's been 9 different systematic reviews. Maybe they didn't like the word proven. For infections, coronavirus, especially for our seniors, immunocompromised, and frontline workers. So why would
and you aren't selling it? I would go to jail for it because
right.
Yeah,
so I'm not selling it. I basically there's to 2017 a systematic review came out clearly showing, looking at 11,000 participants. So the issue is it's not even about science anymore. So it's essentially moved to a model of a finite set of people serving the interests of another finite set of people. And if they don't, they'll probably be out of the club. That's what's fundamentally going on. But if you go back to what you were just saying, when we really look back at history, when we look at even quote unquote infectious diseases, what actually caused the real decline in infectious diseases? Well, if you look in this country, a century ago, 1900s, I think there was about 40 to 40 out of 100,000 people were dying of infectious diseases. Before even the advent of vaccines, right, that went down about a half, about 100,000. Massive decline. Well, where did that come from? Well, that came from sanitation, vitamin A, nutrition, elimination of child labor, refrigeration, infrastructure at the political level as well as, at the actual brick and mortar. Well, how did we get that? And this is one layer people need to understand from a human standpoint. Well, it came because in the late 1800s, there was a massive force of the American working class who were militant and they fought for those rights. People lived in squalor. People, no one cared for them. And it was the uprising of those people in very, very powerful ways, independently self-organizing systems, all over this country that forced the elites in this country to give them these basic infrastructure because they thought they were going to lose it in the 1930s. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was not really a nice guy, if you really look at it. He did this because of the ferocity of the rising American working class demanding this. So what you see is during that period, you see that infrastructure was given. We have, the gains that we got long before vaccines came. And what's fascinating is in many ways, a plumber and the sanitation worker did far more than even the pharmacist or the medical professional, which came much later. But in my view, Joe, what occurred from that period was those elites in this country were so upset that they had to give something to the working people, they went on an attack on them. So you had the McCarthy era, okay? It's a very interesting period. So you basically deemed all of these people, quote unquote, communists, right? It wasn't, the fact is, the May Day, which is celebrated all over the world, began in America. In the late 1800s, 3 American workers were shot fighting for basic rights. And the working class throughout the world deemed that May Day. Now we've erased that from American history. We think it's all capital C communism. So what I see is the ability for people to organize and demand their rights and get them is what did occur in the late 1900s. And we got massive gains. Now look at infrastructure here today: dirty water, dirty air, dirty food. Things like the Paris Accords actually allowed China to pollute another 11 billion more carbon metric tons. You have the Monsantos of the world, the amount of, small particulates, and we look at them in synergy, how they affect our body. None of that's discussed. None of that. I think the United States got a D+ in infrastructure, the roads, the bridges, and the water systems. And when you don't fix these things in time, they affect all types of environmental things. So the elite in this country do not want to address that. They want to always create a fake problem and a fake solution and to consolidate power. And that's why when you look at this phenomenon that's taking place, it's a penultimate of it taking place, right? You create massive amounts of fear. So people essentially will then be willing, because they're under economic stress, under what they think is a health stress, to give up their rights. And that's where I see this headed. So this is an interesting convergence of health policy, the economic attack, or attack on people's health, people's economy, and freedom. So truth, freedom, and health are all under attack. And I think, when you look at the aspect, you just talked about the surveillance state, right? You have Google, which claims that they are liberals, right? They want to help the world, et cetera. Well, do they? They basically do not want any discussion about indigenous people's medicines, right? That have worked for centuries. They don't want to talk about simple solutions, because if you follow the chain of their little cabal, it's a very incestuous group of people. So you suppress discourse, you suppress debate, you suppress freedom, and you move everything away from the scientific method, which is a process where you actually have to prove stuff, which is what they claim they want to do, to scientific consensus. So freedom gets suppressed, and now you can move truth to scientific consensus. And so you go from suppression of freedom to a frankly fake science, or outdated science at worst, at best. And then that is used to create a fake problem and a fake solution. And then if you go to the health part, what that means is you diminish people's health, you control people's health, and now you have a populace which is so controlled, they don't have the strength to even fight for their freedom. So you have the attack on freedom, the attack on truth, and the attack on health. And all of those are interconnected. They too are a system. From a systems perspective, without freedom, you can't have truth. Without truth, you can't have health. And without health, we don't have the strength to fight for our freedom. And the academic, the academic establishment, the entire way that truth actually is discovered should be through the scientific method. That's what's really been compromised, starting, I would say, probably late 50s. And we may want to, discuss that, because I think the viewers here really need to understand that, I was taught always to respect teachers when I was growing up, right? And we had, I think in the 70s, there was still the period of time where we had a lot of dedicated public school teachers. But what has occurred, and the inflection point, in my view, took place in 1970 with the passage of the Mansfield Amendment. The Mansfield Amendment, there was a point where, even though a little piece of a lot of money came from the military budget, interestingly enough, they just threw it to pure basic research in an ironic way. So there were people at Bell Labs, people at interesting institutions just doing, really cool stuff. And even before that, it was hobbyists. It was never driven by, hey, I want to start a company, I have to make $1 billion. It was people essentially motivated by curiosity at the edges who were doing amazing innovations and work. After World War II, after you had the Manhattan Project, after then Sputnik took place, that was used, that fear in some ways was used to essentially create these consolidated institutions of science. And in 1961, John Kennedy gave a very famous speech to the National Academy of Sciences, and he basically said, look, the problems of the world are becoming large-scale systems problems, essentially what he was saying. And we rely on you, to these scientists, to help us uncover the truth in these. And he goes, this is a conundrum of democracy, because you guys are a small elite group, and we're outsourcing, our decision-making to you under the hope that you're disinterested, objective third parties. And that was this very interesting point he made. And I think Kennedy was very observant about this, that this had become a conundrum of democracy.
Let me just, excuse me the interruption, but that Kennedy's comment was based after Eisenhower's comment a few years previously, where he said that he warned us when he was, I believe, just getting ready to leave the presidency.
61, or yeah.
Yeah, so it was within the same year. Right. The dangers of the military-industrial complex. So you can tie those two together.
Yeah, so Eisenhower he basically was saying that there was a moment in history where all these innovations came from everyday Americans, bottoms up. And now that was being consolidated. And what would that mean for this country? And we are basically witnessing that trajectory that Eisenhower and Kennedy predicted. Particularly, Eisenhower predicted, by the way, there was another great senator, William Fulbright. He's the one who coined the term military-industrial academic complex. In Eisenhower's original speech, I believe he had military-industrial academic complex, but I believe Jay Stratton, who was his advisor from MIT, had him remove the word academic. So it became the military-industrial complex. But Fulbright brought out those, that essentially what some people call the quote unquote golden triangle, where all great innovations and solutions come out of. And to me, Joe, this is personal because, I grew up in Newark, New Jersey. I was working as a full-time research fellow at the age of 14, because I was one of those kids who was very motivated doing medical research. While finishing up high school, I'd gone to NYU in a computer science program the summer before, and I was literally looking at baby sleep patterns using computing. This is in '78, when a computer would occupy a huge room. Now, while I was there in a small medical college, I was given this great challenge to convert the old-fashioned, remember the old-fashioned interoffice mail system, inbox, outbox folders?
Oh, sure.
This was the interoffice mail system. It was the foundation how communication took place. It wasn't just simply text messages, but I was asked to convert that entire system, blind carbon copy, registered mail, the address book, into the electronic form. And I wrote 50,000 lines of code, named that system email, and got the first copyright, Joe, long before I came to MIT. Now, the reason I shared that was I never spoke about it. I called the email, wrote the code, have the copyright. Well, went through the MIT journey, which is MIT is the military industrial academic complex, right? Great.
Really? Wait. That's a profound statement. And from someone who has many degrees from MIT, could you expand on that? Because that's news to me. I didn't just realize that.
Yeah. What, the invention of email?
No. Which, that's interesting.
Yeah, but you're saying going into MIT.
MIT was the military-industrial complex.
Well, it is. Look, so MIT, if you look at it fundamentally, in the 1940s, the transition took place when Vannevar Bush, the president of MIT, left to form a company called Raytheon. There's a great book I have here written by David Noble. David Noble, a great social historian. And Noble wrote this book called Forces of Production. He was a professor, history of science professor at MIT, and he said that moment in when Vannevar Bush left to form Raytheon, he said that's when we actually lost true education, because the public universities essentially became funnels for starting large-scale military endeavors, using private, where money was moved from public to military endeavors. So MIT at that point really started transitioning to becoming part of the military-industrial complex. So if you think about a guy like me, when I came there, it's a liberal university. I did many things there that I was on the front page for inventing many other things, a tool called EchoMail when I won my Fulbright. But in 2011, when all my stuff went into the Smithsonian documenting the fact that I invented the first email system, the backlash was profound, Joe. And this is not about even the invention of email discussion. It is, why was it so profound? Because it wasn't done in the bastions of Silicon Valley, MIT, et cetera. It was done before. You see, it doesn't compute that great innovations could come from outside this military-industrial academic complex, that all great innovations must come from that complex. And this relates to this essential hegemony of who creates what is a solution, who's an innovator, et cetera. By the way, the first TV was invented by a 14-year-old kid in Franklin, Idaho. Outside of that, and there has been this larger brainwashing that has occurred to the American public that all great innovations must come from war. Okay, so if you look at it, that we should be so thankful we go kill some people over there, because we'll get some innovation out of a Tang or Velcro, right? Which, by the way, didn't come out of the military complex. But we've been brainwashed to think that we have to go around like this to touch our nose, as we say in India, right? You can't touch it like this. That we should be ready to do something abnormal and be thankful that you get these great innovations out of it. And it's basically purposefully obfuscating reality in some way to make us believe that we should not follow our own instincts and our own common sense. So historically in this country, innovations came from bottoms up. And then now it's been consolidated that it must come top down. So the COVID-19 issue also has this very important aspect. You have one person, Fauci. He is essentially driving the entire country's economic policy now under this thesis that, we must flatten the curve. We must wait for this vaccine, and any discussion about any other alternative therapies is not even on that radar. Any discussion, hey, why don't we protect our healthcare workers who we supposedly they claim they care for with certain types of vitamins, A, D, and other things, at least to give them some protection, layering of protection. That's not even on there. So the entire focus is fundamentally about a reductionist model of a few solutions that they control and own. And so when you go back to heart disease, I think 640,000 people die of heart disease, nearly 570,000 people have cancer, 440,000 minimum of medical errors, another 200,000 from prescription drugs. If you take the latter 3 and 4, it's more than heart disease and cancer. But
those numbers are all per year.
Per year. But those have never been made public health issues. We have not said, hey, let's shut down the economy to address the fact that we have skyrocketing obesity taking place, skyrocketing diabetes. So the level of contradiction, the level of hypocrisy should wake up everyone to understand that there is always another agenda. There is another agenda. That's what's going on. Again, I repeat what my mentor said: when things don't add up, you must take a step back and say, what is the other agenda? And the only thing in a common sense way that reveals itself to me is power, profit, and control. Power, profit, and control. Those are the 3 things that come. So we're looking at a world where a finite set of people, and by the way, these people aren't nationalists, they're not Americans, they're not Chinese, they're not Indians. It's a set of people who don't, frankly, care about any particular state. It is about caring about their future, and that's it. And we are essentially little automatons on some large network that must serve that purpose. So that is why when you look at this, it is essentially, in my view, it's to essentially retrain us to essentially accept top-down model, even in a much more profound way. And this has been going on for years, right? But it seems like at some point you have this interesting point where there's a real complete assault on truth, freedom, and health. And that's what's taking place right now.
Yes, indeed. And just to expand on that a bit, one of my favorite recent books is Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff, who is a tenured professor at Harvard Business School and did unbelievable work on this and documented how Google is really the leader of this. And they were really forced into it because they, in the early 2000s, I think they went into it for the right reasons, but they didn't generate any revenue. So they were under pressure. It was a tech that bust out in the 2000, and they had to find some way to capitalize themselves. And they initially started doing it to sell ads, and they used this technology, and they had a great computer system and wonderful scientists figured out how to sell ads really well and essentially predict behavior from this excess behavioral surplus that they were capturing through their computer systems. And they just evolved, and they realized they could do this. And then they realized they've been doing this for 2 decades now, that they've acquired so much knowledge and information that they can manipulate behavior and essentially learned how to control this. And there's little doubt in my mind that this information they've learned over the last 2 decades has probably been used to engineer this epidemic in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, look, in 1993, Joe, when I started my PhD, one of the areas I was very interested in was pattern analysis. You know, if you look at when my grandmother would observe your face, she was essentially doing an intuitive idea to place you in some multidimensional space of your particular balance, and then she would find out what was appropriate for you. So in 1993, my second interesting event with email, and it was always there, was the Clinton White House was getting tons of inbound email. Remember, email was an office application. 93 became a consumer application with the web. So the White House was getting 5,000 emails a day, and they were doubling. So they ran a contest to see were there AI technologies that could automatically read the email and sort it. Clinton was literally printing them out in the White House and having interns handle it. But anyway, so I ended up winning that contest, left MIT to start a company called EchoMail, ECHOMAIL. And what I noticed was we were building a way to analyze unstructured text to see what people were saying. And what I learned was, I remember looking at Nike's email one day, and you learned that you could actually cluster people reasonably well. You could do an ad and you would see how people would respond with email. And I'm not saying people are robots, but the advertising out here could control the response through email, and that data could be used to say, okay, these people are interested in this, and then you could send them out a particular sale item, right? So we built this technology called EchoMail, but what I noticed was that the ability to observe people, which is the observation piece, collect data, and then controllability. This is what control systems do. When you file in an automatic pilot in an airplane is gathering data. It has a destination it wants to go to. It gathers, constantly gathering data, which is the observability piece. And then it does controllability to adjust things little by little. So the issue is, what is the goal in control systems? You have a goal. What is the goal of these individuals? What is the end goal, right? Because obviously the gathering of data, in an airplane, you want to go from Boston to San Francisco, and you're trying to control your, plane's all obviously off course 99% of the time, and you're making small adjustments. In advertising and marketing, you want to get return on investment or on a product sale, right? So you're gathering data and you're doing targeting. Okay, this person is a woman. She bought a handbag. She'll probably buy a necklace. All the Amazons and all these people when they dish up stuff. But the end goal here, to me, appears to be the end goal is merely control for maximizing, eliminating a lot of friction to make profit, at a very deep level. That's one thing. So power, profit, and control is the goal. So in order to maximize that, you must have incredible amount of surveillance. You must have the ability to manipulate, just like that airplane, very, very quickly. It's basically converting this entire thing to one social engineered machine. And so you can move people and labor as you need, when you need it. Yeah. And that's what I think we're seeing. So, China, I think, has one camera for every 4 people. And the United States is probably heading there pretty rapidly with 5G, et cetera. But the level of surveillance that's occurring and the level of computing power we have now to manipulate people is what's taking place. So I think from a behavioral standpoint, this COVID-19, the quarantining, the epidemic, I agree with you. I think this was well planned, and they're gathering tremendous amounts of data on how people are reacting, which groups of people are reacting certain way, where you have to watch for hotspots. Tremendous amount of information is being gathered to help in the next time that this occurs.
Yes. And more than likely, the 2 biggest concerns that we have, well, the primary one from my viewpoint is the absolute devastation of the economy and the collapse. And who knows what that may be, a social disaster rise in the street. I mean, that I'm not predicting that, but it's certainly a potential. But beyond that, what's clear is that we're going to have this annual epidemic of flus. We've been having it for a long time. This is a recurrent theme. Okay, it's going to happen. So we're likely moving towards mandatory vaccinations of an unproven, unsafe vaccine in the not too distant future. And the other risk is a continued loss of our freedoms that have been won at very severe price by our ancestors. And we're going to lose them. We lost this big section of them at the 9/11. Shortly after with the anthrax and the Patriot Act was implemented, and people still, I believe, don't have a full understanding of the loss of personal freedoms as a result of the implementation of that act that can be implemented just about many times. I think probably portions of it were implemented in this epidemic. So, I mean, it is mind-boggling the power and control they already have. And it seems like they have all the power they need, but they're still seeking to get more. So those are some of the risks. So, I don't want to perseverate too much on this because we don't want to be focusing on the skies falling, but we want to be somewhat hopeful and give people specifics, simple strategies they can implement to get around this. So you can comment on what I just said, but then I want to move into the discussion and dialogue about some of the things that we can do and what we can focus on, not only to keep us healthy and what we can do to treat it if we have a little viral infection, but what we can do to address this manipulation that's a result of this surveillance economy that has been morphed and largely facilitated and catalyzed through Google, and now, of course, implemented from Facebook and even Amazon, so Microsoft. So why don't we start there?
Yeah. So Joe, I think for people listening, I think it's important to understand the problem, right? Yeah. And then it's important to have a framework on how we can actually tackle the problem. So one of the ways that I describe it is literally using a triangle. You have freedom, truth, and health. Truth, freedom, and health is, I think, what we all want. The opposition to that is power, profit, and control. But if you look at that triangle, one is you have to understand we need to have freedom to discourse, debate, academic freedom, all of that. And from that, we get truth, as I mentioned. And from truth, we're able to actually understand health, not only of our body, health in the broadest sense, systems health of our infrastructure, our environment, et cetera. And then we have the strength to fight for freedom now. So in each one of those, there's, I've thought about this, and here's a solution. For example, when you go to freedom, if you look at the communication we're doing right now, we are heavily reliant on Google, Facebook, and then probably 3 major telco companies. So basically 5 CEOs control basically our communication. One phone call to them, and you can essentially shut down communication. This is not that far-fetched. If we look at what happened in Egypt, remember when the massive protests were going on there, people were using social media, the movement was rising, and in fact, workers were starting to come out in the street, and Hosni Mubarak made one call to Vodafone and he shut everything down. So what is the solution? Well, it's going to sound interestingly, initially weird, but every time I've shared this, people go, what are you saying? And then it makes a lot of sense. The founding fathers of this country created an institution called the United States Postal Service. It was a public commons. Why did they create that? Because the crown was not allowing each individual to communicate. So the notion of the press was all of us were the press. There was not like, New York Times. Each one of us were supposed to be the press. So the Postal Service comes into being by these very enlightened founders, which was I could send you a letter and you could send me a letter and no one could communicate. The Postal Service, they also created what was called a police force. If anyone interfered with your and I communications, 20 years, sentence in prison. It was criminal. Okay? So the entire Postal Service system, if you look at it, it was a distributed, decentralized environment, enabling every American to communicate for pennies. It was quite phenomenal, right? Up until 1967 or 670, nearly 60% of the mail that went through the Postal Service was political mail, left wing, right wing, Green Party, everyone. Now, in 1997 is when email volume overtook postal mail volume. I met with the executives of the Postal Service. I said, look, you guys should be actually living up to what you were chartered to do, which is to protect free communications. Why don't you offer a public email service and public social media services? I bet you Americans would pay $50, but that would be protected by the laws of the Constitution. No one, including the government, could interfere. They thought it was a ridiculous idea, Joe. And then they laughed at me. They said, you're a 29-year-old kid. We're bigger than Walmart. Anyway, 2011, the Postal Service is going out of business. Why? Because all the best parts of the Postal Service were privatized into DHL and FedEx. So I again hit him really hard. The Inspector General, Dave Williams, called me up. He goes, Shiva, why are you attacking us? I go, look, you guys are not doing your job. You're not in the postal mail business. You were supposed to be in the communications business. You were set up as a quasi organization to protect our rights. So anyway, I did 2 chartered reports for them, Joe. It's still there. My point is we need a Digital Rights Act, and there is an institution which can deploy that. It is the Postal Service, in my view, and the tower, all these Postal Service locations could be converted to a mesh network. So there is an opportunity to have a network by the people for the people. Now, if someone wants to go use Google and Facebook, and you can, but there needs to be the public commons. This is not an idea. It's not communism or socialism per se. It is more saying that there are certain things that should be the public commons. So it's a Digital Rights Act.
Well, let me stop there because that's a brilliant idea. But don't you think that the 0.001% is a very few people I've ever heard reference to that. They say the 1%. It's not. It's the 0.001%.
Yeah.
And another
10 people. Yeah.
Don't you think those few elite, that group would object to this and have the power and control to prevent that from being implemented?
Definitely. That's why I believe ultimately we need to have a mass movement, Joe. Nothing has ever been given to us. People think, slavery ends one day and we have freedom the other day. Every point in human history has always been people chipping away at slavery to get freedom. From the time, look, I came, you may know this, I came from an India where we were considered untouchables. India had that hierarchy, the small set of the Brahmanical priesthood, the kings, the warriors, and then everyone else was called Shudras, So I have seen what this does to deteriorating the human spirit, right? What it does to people. But we are heading into a neo-caste system, or we're probably already there. Mm-hmm. But that's something very tangible people could fight for. People need something they can say, yeah, why isn't the Postal Service doing that? There's a report written, et cetera. And it could make them billions of dollars, by the way. Yeah. The second part of this is now we have the ability for people to have discourse, that competition to Facebook and Google. Let's talk about truth. How is truth created? Well, today, since the Mansfield Amendment, since science has become consolidated, since the academic today practices the oldest profession, the real scientists are essentially, the crazy people come up with different ideas. They're actually dismissed. What we've done is it's mediocrity to the mean now, right? So you have to be part of the club. You can't ruffle feathers. The entire peer review scientific process. If you look at the NIH, who sits on the board when a decision is made, who gets funded, you look at the major journal editors, and you look at the major heads of departments, they're pretty much, there's a big overlap. So that's why 70% of the biological sciences funding probably goes to probably 10 major institutions, right? Forget the guys in state institutions who may be doing some really cool work, like I was in Newark, right? Those guys don't get funded. It's essentially bringing everything to the mean. And if you don't support that mean, you never get tenure, you won't get grants, you won't be funded. So the entire process, when we as Americans give $10, $20 billion, whatever it is, to the NIH, that funding gets dispersed to an insider group. And if you and I just got our PhD and we have 7 years to get tenure, I better fall in line. Not only do I have to publish papers that meet the norm of that field, but I also have to get cited. In order to get tenure, it's not I publish 10 papers or 100 papers. The experts in the field have to say, hey, Joe's doing great work in cancer biology. I'm citing his paper. So when your tenure review comes up, they'll say, oh, how many of the other leaders said, Joe Mercola or Shiva Ayyadurai has done good work. And if you don't have those reference letters, you're never going to get tenure. So what this is, it's really, really a kissing up model, right? It's not for innovation. So here's a solution to that. We need to go to a citizen science model. All this funding we give, it's our money. So if you are a researcher at MIT, Harvard, Stanford, and you're doing research, you know what? And you got federally funded dollars. As you're doing those experiments, it should go right up to the cloud. It should, because what the incentive here is you keep your data, it's your data, which it really isn't, and you're going to publish it under your own framework when you want it, so you can do insider trading. And we don't even know where all the climate data is. We don't even know most of this data. So my view is we need to go to a model where we engage millions or billions of people to participate in science. Look, the tools have gotten easier. Everyone has an Excel spreadsheet. Everyone can get these tools. If the data is up there, we could have participatory science. What that means is when we give funding to federal university, it's not your data. Once you get it, if you do an in vitro experiment, you kill an animal, you do some experiment, put it up. The raw data should be going up. And we as people, and there's enough tools now with meta language, how you could code that we could have access to it. So we need to take power away from the academics. And one way to do that is to force decentralization. That's what the Postal Service is. So that's a common theme here. Let's go to health. The entire healthcare model, so that's a Citizens' Right Act. Now we go to the healthcare model. What's fundamentally happened is we've consolidated healthcare. There are people called GPOs and PBMs. Are you familiar with those guys, Joe?
No.
I just learned about these guys. So what happened was in the 70s, if there were 50 hospitals and you and I were hospital administrators and we were all buying all the equipment for our hospital, you're buying bedpans and I'm buying bedpans and they're costing $50. So 50 hospitals said, oh, let's hire this guy, Bill. Bill will do group purchasing for us, like Costco. So he started purchasing, instead of paying $50 a bedpan, we paid $20, right? And he said, and maybe we gave him some salary for that. Well, that was called group GPOs. That was on the hospital side. Similarly, there was another group called pharmacy broker managers, PBMs. They did it for the pharmaceutical side. So these two guys started controlling most of the supply. They don't own anything. They're just writing contracts.
The middlemen.
Middlemen. So even as drugs became generic, let's say there's 3 generic drug providers for insulin. If you wanted to get your drug into these hospitals, you needed a GPO or a PBM to be buddies with you. And the GPOs and the PBMs, according to in 2000, there was a Safe Harbor Act. They were given the rights to give kickbacks to the hospital administrators. Okay? So instead of the bedpan going from 50 to 20, maybe they raised it to 30 or 40, higher cost, and they gave some kickback to the hospital administrators, which included 7-star vacations here, a flight to Vegas. It was all allowed. Okay? So we organized, it was basically legalized corruption. So the GPOs and the PBMs, if you look at their healthcare costs, this is just very mundane stuff without even getting into the alternative stuff. It's about $500 billion. That entire act should be removed. The other piece is that broadly, we need to decentralize healthcare between the individual and the patient. The concept of centralized healthcare, which is what the purpose of this entire events are, that next year, everyone's going to be mandated vaccines. Oh, you want to get your driver's license? Where's your vaccine card, Joe? You want to go to a gym? Where's your vaccine card?
Your digital certificate implanted
or your digital thing on your chip or something like that.
Yeah.
And that's where this is headed to. And for pharma, it is a captive market now. Imagine all 7.2 billion people, because this is a international shutdown. Every prime minister, every president will say, of course we should do that, or at least scared to doing that. So now you have 7.2 billion people. Imagine we're all forced to be on a certain vaccine schedule. $1,000 per person, you're looking about $7 trillion. I mean, this is an example I'm giving you. But so for them to crash an economy, to drive it to depression, to impose that, for them, it's a relatively great return on investment. You make the Fed, print $6 trillion, but you're going to make $7 to $8 trillion recurring revenue. It's basically a minor investment to get. I mean, this is on a very mundane level, but on the healthcare side, we have to do whatever it takes to decentralize healthcare back to the concept of, you and I having a relationship, narrative medicine, because medicine ultimately is an art and it's an information science. The body is too complex to have top-down control. It has to be going back to the individual and the practitioners that they choose. And that's, I think, where the fight is. And it's fundamentally, Joe, when you look at these three things I've said, it comes down to one word: decentralization. Mm-hmm. And it's not centralization, which is fascism. The guy who advised Mussolini came up with the concept of fascism. You can always trace one of these isms to someone, right? Mm-hmm. Adam Smith, capitalism. Well, fascism went to Mussolini's advisor, I forget his name, and he had a very reductionist view of the body. You know what he had? A top-down view. He said there's a central organ and all the cells are controlled by the central organ. And we know that's not true. Mm-hmm. The body, if anything, is a self-organizing system of 6 trillion cells, 60 trillion bacteria, 380 trillion viruses interacting together. It's a bottoms-up model. So I think the opportunity here is to start educating people. It is supposed to be we the people. And this does not mean it's going to happen without struggle. We may have to rise up and fight in ways that we haven't done before, just like those people did in the late 1800s. Mm-hmm. And the idea is to compel people to think everything will be legislative. Like what I see, and I've been an activist most of my life, Joe, before I decided to run for Senate, et cetera. But the reason I never liked electoral politics was because I noticed there was a physics there. You had the establishment. People like to keep things the way they are. There's a people who want to rise up on their own, and they may not be perfect, everyday people. And then in between that, Joe, there's another system here called the not so obvious establishment. And it's the people who always drive people, and they may do it purposefully, they may do it because they're dumb, is to always tell people, oh, don't go build a movement on your own, self-organizing, bring everything into the legislature. Always drive people into legislative views. And what we've seen occur there is that they control all the cards. So we need to build a broad-based movement bottoms up. And you've seen this over and over and over again in history. People rise up and then people create a legislature where things are supposed to be discourse and controlled. And I think where we've gotten to, because of the not so obvious establishment, and you can apply this in many ways, is that people have been compelled to outsource their citizenship to others. Mm-hmm. And the reality is, it's really a glimpse of how anything's ever been achieved in human history. It's always been catalysts to share information. And that's sort of where I see my sort of humble role, to share information. But the idea is for people to recognize that they need to build a bottoms-up movement, bottoms up. And I think it begins with taking care of your health.
Yeah, well, let's get it in a moment. I'm particularly curious about you running for the Senate. Did you actually get the nomination from your party yet?
No, so last year I ran against Warren as an independent. This year I'm running as a Republican. Frankly, just to be clear, I don't care for either party.
Yeah, I know, but you almost need a party nomination to get in the game.
You need it, yeah. So right now we have an amazing ground support. We have to get 10,000 signatures to get on the ballot. So it was me running against a guy called Markey, Democrat, and then they realized I would probably beat him. They threw a guy called Joe Kennedy on the Democrat, but now they threw a Republican against me. I had a clear shot to the Republican nomination. He's got about 100 Twitter followers, just came out of nowhere. Clearly a Manchurian candidate supported by the GOP establishment. The good news for us is we have an amazing group of volunteers, mothers who, working people who come out bottoms up, and it's on one singular issue, not one singular issue, but one compelling issue is health, Joe. They are all really, really upset with this mandated vaccine model. A lot of them. They are starting to connect the dots from a systems approach that, hey, without freedom, you can't have truth and health. So we're trying to unify a lot of these movements that were disparate, even the 2A movement, okay? Which, people typically start, they're just gun-toting guys, right? But even those guys see the connection to the mandated medicine piece. So it's quite extraordinary, but it's totally bottoms up. Everyone's, yeah, it's awesome.
A few years ago, I was being considered to get the nomination from the Republican Party to run for senator in Illinois.
I say.
And I refused it because I did some thought process and went forward and considered what would happen if I would won, and it was not a good scenario. And it would be like beating my head against a brick wall, knowing that there's nothing I can do. And I'm wondering, I mean, it's great to be a senator, but you're still encumbered in this beyond challenging process of which seems like one individual, no matter how firmly committed, can make a difference.
Well, so Joe, it's why. So I have a different perspective on this because I've been a student of political history for years.
Okay, good.
I know.
That's what I want to hear.
Yeah. So what I see this as being part of a movement. Okay. So if I were to say, well, I'm going to get into the Senate and I'm going to pass these bills, it's totally delusional. Okay. Yeah. Delusional. However, if I say the things that I stand for, I mean, you just heard what we put them up on our site on shivaforsenate.com. You go there. We have a Health Rights Act, Digital Rights Act, a Health Rights Act, citizens. It's sort of bringing people together to truth, freedom, and health. So what's fundamentally happening, Joe, is that I believe it's movements. It's been political movements that have always changed the world, not a Republican or a Democrat, not the left or the right, but it's been people's movements. And what we're dealing with this COVID crisis, even though it seems so horrible, and the reason these videos I've done, I think, are going viral all over the world is because people inherently know something's wrong. And when it comes to their health, it's something that's beyond left or right. It's something that you're trying to figure out, wait a minute, it's about my health and what happens to my kids, and it's the economic piece. So we've hit a very interesting resonance here, a resonance frequency. So what I see running for Senate, imagine 6 years, a guy like me in the US Senate, and what we've done, just with this video, and, it's not like we have Botox here and lighting, right? Right. But it's the ability to use that platform with the US Senator every day, hammering the dysfunction, hammering the hypocrisy, because that will create a wave, I believe, and that wave will compel other people to be active citizens. That is a win. Am I counting on putting a bill in and them passing the Health Rights Act? No way. They're never going to do that. But you know what? The more rational things I do without uncompromising, when people say, wait a minute, what's going on, right? I want this, right? And what he's saying makes so much sense. And it's at a level that can be used as a platform. Now, if I didn't, and that platform has to be part of a larger movement. And so when we're going, I literally go out on the streets, Joe, and I collect signatures. Everything we do is bottoms up. On our website, when people donate to the campaign, I give them a book because I don't like taking anything called How Your Body is a System. We give them a tool to understand system dynamics. So whatever happens with that, we're going to win anyway, because we would have inspired people to say, wait a minute, the ankle bone's connected to the foot bone. I heard this guy running and he just taught me this stuff that no other politician has taught me. And that's what the founders of this country were. There were people like you and I. They were doctors, physicians, blacksmiths, engineers. They actually created stuff. These people were children of the Enlightenment, right? Mm-hmm. They came with understanding science. Washington was a surveyor. He was a farmer. Jefferson was an architect. What do we have now? 70% lawyers and lobbyists. They work in the abstract world of moving words around and manipulating contracts. They don't work in the nuts and bolts of reality. So I think my winning here would be such some people have said, some great revolutionaries have said, people need inspiration. And Massachusetts, in my view, Joe, is the center of the deep state. If I use that term to refer to the center of the military-industrial academic complex. If you go to Cambridge, Massachusetts, there's a square called Kendall Square, and you look around, you'll see Google, office, you'll see Facebook, you'll see Amazon, you'll see Novartis, you'll see MIT, you'll see Harvard, right? And it's the center of the deep state, because every major international probably person who runs some country has gone through there. Every major economic collapse could be traced to some professor at Harvard, okay? What we're talking about is that is the center of the center, of pretty much the world. And the people who run it are one united party. They're not left or right. They're not Republican or Democrat. There's no way they want me to get on the ballot this time, okay? So in my view, our struggle in Massachusetts is really symbolizes the struggle for everyone out there to really, for truth, freedom, and health. That's what this is becoming. And I think I just happened to was very fortunate from my background, having been able to get this education, being an insider there, understanding how they work, and to be able to articulate this. And bottom line, the people that are coming, Joe, are working people they're not like students alone, right? They're not politicos. Everyone on our staff, 70% of our volunteers are now women, and they're mothers who are really concerned about what's going to happen to their kids. So it's really, really inspiring.
Is Massachusetts taking away the vaccine exemptions now?
Yes. So they have a bill so when I got involved in September, I've been involved in the health thing for years with Cytosolve and Systems Health, and we actually created a seal called Clean Food Certified, right? So there's many things I've been doing in health for 40 years, but when I looked at the vaccine thing, there were people who've been involved in this movement. Joe, it's a different discussion we can have, but it was always legislative. I said, look, we need to get on the ground. We need to unleash hell on the ground. The people in New Jersey, for example, took that message and we stopped them there. It was quite inspiring. January 6th, 13th, it was a big victory for the for the medical freedom movement. And it was right then Corona came, okay? It's quite interesting. So to me, if you want to start talking about engineering this, someone in a dashboard is saying, wait a minute, Hong Kong is on fire, Wuhan, wait a minute, they just won this thing, and wait a minute, what just happened in New Jersey? People came bottoms up and they won, and they do not want people to come bottoms up. They always want intermediaries. They always want, go negotiate with this legislator, hire a lobbyist. And it's never going to go anywhere, Joe. It has to be bottoms up movement. It has to be a movement by the people.
Well, you've got a lot to say about systems health and how it applies to this pandemic. And so why don't you highlight some of your recommendations and expand on what you think people should be doing to to build up their health so they immunize themselves normally and have a strong immune system, so that when they encounter this virus in the environment, they'll have a good, strong, innate immune response and maybe have a few sniffles or a little fever, and that's the end of it.
Yeah, so I think the first is education, Joe. There's two parts to that, the answer I have. One is for people to understand, hey, the body's a system, okay? So in 2007, when I finished my PhD, I went back to India for about 2 years on a Fulbright to study the interconnection of systems biology and traditional medicine. And what came out of that was I found that the traditional systems of medicine, the language that they use, which we think sounds weird to the typical Westerner, Vata, Pitta, Kapha, if you know Ayurveda, or fire, water, earth. It turns out the words there are directly related to engineering control systems theory. And I wrote a very interesting paper in an engineering systems journal. And it basically showed that the ancient rishis and yogis were actually looking at the body as a system, and the words that they use actually correspond one-to-one with Western control systems theory. Anyway, when I got back to the United States, I offered a course at MIT. 200, 300 people would show up on a Thursday night, and we taught them this very different way of looking at the body in different terminology. Anyway, so that became an institute that I have called Systems Health. And I also built a tool called Your Body, Your System that anyone can use, okay? So understand their body as a system. And it's sort of like, I know some of the personalization stuff you've done, but it uses engineering systems principles. So the first thing I want to teach people is that if they can start moving into understanding that their body is a system, and they're very simple principles, you can understand how your body moves the forces of transport, conversion, and storage, and how foods and exercises actually modulate those. So that's one thing that people should understand. So people want to go to Your Body, Your System, they can understand that. The second piece is on a very tactical level, at the molecular level, coming from the Western side, what we can do. Well, I think you just go back to very fundamental basics, okay? The sun, is a very powerful vehicle, okay? You just said you were out walking, right? In the sun.
In the sunshine, on the
In the
beach.
sun. In the sunshine.
I live in Florida, and they closed most of the beaches, but fortunately, I live in a county that on the East Coast that is somewhat enlightened and only closed the beach for one day and now allowed anyone who wants to walk or run on the beach to go back on.
Yeah, and especially people of color, we need more sun.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah, so what you have is the sun, the UVB radiation, supports the generation of vitamin D. And I think both of us would agree, if you can get it from the natural source, it's the best, 15, 20 minutes. Now, if you can't get it from there, D3 is a very powerful supplement, cholecalciferol. But what does vitamin D do? I have a couple of videos, but very simply, why is vitamin D valuable? And by the way, again, most MDs are not trained in this. Vitamin D creates these things. I know you've talked about catholicedins. The catholicedins, in some ways, a vitamin D is like a musket. The catholicedins are the bullets, because these catholicedins literally go disrupt the membrane of, be it the viruses or be it the bacteria, et cetera. So you have a direct, very powerful medicine, which is vitamin D. In the letter I wrote to the president, I was trying to modulate immune health and economic health. Fauci's model is to shut down everything. I said, look, let's use some of the principles of modern medicine and partition people into 4 groups. Those people who you say have COVID-19 and actually have it. Those people who are in critical condition. Those people are immunocompromised, pre-existing conditions, and those people are quote unquote healthy, okay? Well, the people who have COVID-19 and are the immunocompromised, let's give them at least during a short period, very high dosage of vitamin D and A. 400,000 IUs of A, for 2 days, and 50,000 IUs of D for 2 days. By the way, these dosages are well recorded in the literature. In fact, they're pediatric dosages people used to give for measles. So you give those people, they immediately give them support. Why? Because now the body can, with vitamin D, can generate those catholicedins as an antimicrobial. The vitamin A is also very important. Again, a lot of MDs unfortunately didn't get this education, is that vitamin A builds those cytokeratins, which literally build quote unquote walls around your epithelial cells and protect you. So that's the second piece. The third piece is vitamin C. For the critical condition people, vitamin C, 100 grams, IV drip. Again, these are proven solutions people have used in stress-like conditions. And for the broad mass of people, it's a dosage of vitamin A, around 10,000 IUs, vitamin D 5 to 10,000 if you're not getting it in the sun. And then vitamin C, 250 to 1,000 milligrams. But more importantly, we all know as you age, the thyroid function starts depleting, and your body's not able to convert these carotenoids into vitamin A. So the iodine and the iodide, that combination there's different brands out there. People go look at like Lugol's, et cetera, 3 drops for kids, 6 drops for adults. But these are just pillars. I'm not saying they're not amazing other solutions, zinc and oregano. I mean, there's a whole bunch of pillars, other components. But if you go back to the basics, the sun, okay? Every culture always revered the sun. So vitamin D. Vitamin A, the highly rich green vegetables, right? Or the dark vegetables, which have high carotenoids. That's vitamin A. So this is sort of just basic, which supports your immune health, supports your immune system. You're essentially enabling, particularly A and D, they're not just vitamins, they're hormones. They modulate many of the processes in the immune system. 4 months ago, Joe, I gave a talk at the National Science Foundation. I was asked to give their distinguished lecture. And what I talked about is when vaccination came in the 60s, right? When the National Vaccine Act was put into place by John Kennedy, they had a very nascent understanding of the immune system. It was sort of a 2-box model, the innate system and the adaptive system. Well, now we know we have the interferon system, the gut microbiome. It's much more complex. But what does emerge out of that understanding is that it is a dysfunctional, weakened immune system that overreacts to the pathogens that attacks our own body. So what we want to do is modulate that system. So you want to have things that, immunomodulate. The D and the A are not just protectors, antimicrobials, and form that cytokeratin walls, but they actually modulate many different processes. Obviously, the other thing is sugar, okay? When you eat a lot of high sugar foods, your body produces, things like candida, which create gliotoxins, which knock out your macrophages and knock out your T cells, 2 of the 6 cylinders or X number of cylinders. So what does your body do when those are knocked down? It only has to rely on your cytokine storm to handle things. So I would, diet and food, particularly the reduction of sugar, would be very, very valuable for people and protect them from these infections.
Yeah, I would add to that because I used to believe pretty strongly that sugar was useful to remove from the diet, and you certainly want to have a limited amounts of it, certainly processed sugars. But even more important, I think, are the industrially processed vegetable oils. Because the sugars, especially if you're exercising, that acute increase in blood sugar can be readily compensated for, and it can get lower pretty quickly, and it's out of your system. But an industrially processed vegetable oil breaks down to fatty acid, which gets integrated, embedded in your cell membranes. It sticks around for weeks or months or even longer. And that can cause definitely long-term havoc in your system. So I think they're even more dangerous than the sugar. So, but anyway, eating clean. And one more point too about the sun, it's not just vitamin D, because if you're getting sun exposure on naked skin, the near infrared is important to stimulate the release of nitric oxide. And there's clearly studies that show in the coronavirus and SARS, not necessarily SARS-CoV-2 or CoV-2, but it impairs replication of this virus, the nitric oxide. So sun exposure and exercise will help increase the nitric oxide production.
Yeah, I mean, about 5 years ago, remember I told you we created this technology, Cytosolve, which can model molecular mechanisms. One of the earliest things we did was to show the value of that in the endothelial. There have been some very interesting experiments when you exercise or run, blood flows, in your endothelial, and the blood flow actually turns on a structure on the endothelium called the glycocalyx. When the glycocalyx moves from blood flow, your body will release nitric oxide, which has very, very beneficial effects. So we did one of the first things to model that entire process. And what that modeling definitely does show is that obviously exercise is valuable. Arginine is very valuable because in the presence of arginine, your body does put out more NO. But that NO has many, many supportive processes downstream in the immune function, as you just mentioned. Yeah.
So that's, it's not, you don't necessarily take a nitric oxide supplement.
No.
Arginine, and there's citrulline, there's other precursors you can use, but ultimately you have to activate it, because when you make nitric oxide, it's stored in these vesicles in your cells, and it's not until you release it that it becomes a problem, which the near infrared will do, and exercise will do.
Yeah. I think the key thing is while people are at home, it's almost like we've taken 2 steps back. I hope as people listen to our conversation here, people realize the immense power they actually have to recognize that this is really not about a virus. This is about health at a very fundamental point. It is your immune health and it is your economic health, and they both sort of intertwine together in what's taking place. I think the opportunity we have is for people really to recognize that they have a significant opportunity to take sort of 2 steps back while all this is going on, and really take responsibility and recognize they in fact have many ways to understand their immune health. The solutions are actually relatively simple, more simple than we think. Those in power want to make these things very complicated with fear, so we outsource our responsibility to them. So I think the immune health piece, some of the basic things we've talked about that we've shared, is something everyone can take advantage of, vitamin D, vitamin A, and there's many opportunities now for people to learn on their own. That's one piece. The other piece is on the economic side. I think people should recognize that all change has always occurred through us connecting with one another and building movements. It's never occurred top down. And so we're at this interesting point, Joe. I'm finishing this book, Joe, called The Climate of Science. And it's a play on words, but it's got the sun rotating around the earth.
Yeah.
Right? And the subtitle, it's worse, much worse than you think. But the point is that I think when you look at what's going on, we have an incredible opportunity to recognize that that truth itself is basically manufactured today. Quote unquote, truth is manufactured. And if we go back to basic principles, we can actually not only use our own intuition, our gut instinct, but use very fundamental principle. And I think one of the biggest hopes we have is that everyday working people I would venture to say at least more than 50% don't buy a lot of this nonsense. When I'm collecting signatures, Joe, we'll go to sort of the elite neighborhoods like in Cambridge. These people are so scared, right, to not want to. I'm not saying don't wash your hands, but then we go to working class neighborhoods in central Mass. People come up, they sign our papers. They have a much more balanced view of what's going on. So working people, engineers, the plumbers, the electricians, people who actually have to run businesses, who have to deal with customers. In many ways, we're dealing with the nuts and bolts of reality. The good news is there's at least 51% and more of us right now still. So it's not like people should feel there's all hope is gone. I think the issue is that people should awaken ourselves to recognize that we should start taking responsibility for our health. We should connect with those people who have a common sense approach. But at the same time, be aware that there are people who want to control our lives. And what I was saying was in the book, what I talk about is it's either power, profit, or control, which can lead to a dark age, or it can be a golden age. And so it really comes down to how technology is deployed and who owns technology. So if it's a Gates, if it's a Zuckerberg, it's a few guys at Google, it's a WHO and the CDC. That is a cabal that wants to move it to a dark age of power, profit, and control. And so that's where we're at. That's when we put out this interesting thing called Fire Fauci. It's gone viral. I think it was trending on Twitter right now. And it was basically, I think 20, 30,000 people have signed that petition, nearly 300, 400 doctors. So there's still a part of the medical community that gets it. So I think we're right at that inflection point, Joe, where we can have an amazing awakening, or we could head into the dark ages. Nothing is, written in the stars. It really comes down to what we want to do. So I think...
I agree. Developing community around this issue is really a key, but how do you do that in this age of electronic surveillance and essentially communication channels are essentially monopolized by the surveillance capitalist?
Yeah, I think you're bringing up a very, very important issue. That's why I think we have to rally around something that's simple so people can, I think, educate themselves. That's why I've tried to make it simple: truth, freedom, and health. Truth, freedom, and health. Because in that slogan is pretty much, you can devolve that and you can go as deep as you want, but I think people need something tangible. Fortunately, I've had a little time to think about these things, but I think people should recognize, where does truth come from? Where does freedom come from? Where does health? But I think it starts with education and an awakening of how these things are interconnected from a systems approach. Otherwise, it's always going to seem like too gargantuan of a problem to handle, Joe. And I think that's what those in power want. They want people to feel depressed. They want people to feel helpless. They want people to feel hopeless, like you can't figure out all this. And it actually comes down to something very simple. Without freedom, you can't have truth. Without truth, we're never going to have health. Without health, we can't fight for freedom. And if people sort of focus, if people sort of focus on those three things, it starts giving them a framework in their own local communities to understand what they should not ever give up. I mean, fundamentally, Joe, I think it comes down to, what does it mean to be a human being, right?
Yeah, the basics, right? The basics.
Yeah, the basics of, are we an automaton, a slave, who's going to just be a unit of production in someone else's massive engine, where we are just a unit, we'll be vaccinated on this schedule, then we'll go to work on this schedule, right? And we'll get a paycheck on this schedule. It's basically, that whole Metropolis movie from many, many years ago.
I agree.
Or are we a human being? So it's really an individual's choice. I don't think each individual can forgive themselves of their own responsibility in this. Everyone has a chance to choose what they want to do with their lives, and what does it mean to be a human being. Now, let's say a set of people want to choose that they want to be an automaton, they want to be part of the machine. Well, that's what they're going to be part of. But I don't think people want that. I think the human spirit is pretty alive from what I've seen.
All right. So yeah, the key is avoiding slavery and tyranny to
right.
avoid. And I think even more importantly, to focus on this as being an opportunity.
Exactly.
This is good. This isn't bad. This isn't devastating. Right. Here's that the world's crashing, but no, this is an opportunity. Mm-hmm. So to reframe it in the positive, I think it's a very powerful position. So thank you for stating that. Thank you for being a light. Thank you for being a catalyst for this necessary movement, and really for giving people hope and courage. I think that's what we need.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I say, Joe, to everyone is, you should know the truth, you should be the light, and you should find your way, which means it's time that everyone realize that they're an agent of change, that by understanding how systems work, they can also be a light unto themselves to lead their way, but also to lead other people. We need all to start learning, teaching, and serving each other. And that's really the opportunity for all of us in whatever small or large way.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's a powerful message. Thank you for sharing it. And
thank you. Yeah.
All right. Keep up the good work.
Thanks.